Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Nightmare Press podcast. Today, my guest is Matt Bialer.
Bialer.
Bialer. Okay, sorry, I should have asked you that before we went on.
That's okay.
But he is a poet, a street photographer. He does watercolor paintings, and he is also a literary agent of quite some experience. I want to thank you, Matt, for coming on and
It's a
being a
pleasure.
guest. I'm sure you're quite busy, so I know you're taking some time out here. Now, I remember when I first noticed Matt, when I was querying agents myself, I came across your stuff, and when I was doing my research, and I saw that you do all this other stuff that you're not, that you're really involved with, like writing and art and photography. I thought that was really interesting, and not only that, you represent some pretty well-known authors such as Tad Williams and Patrick Rothfuss, to name just a couple. Um, and I thought it was also cool that you were involved with some small press, like you had your own poetry at small presses, and I was like, this is a guy I could probably really just get along with. So,
Thank
um,
you.
and so tell us who we're watching.
Well,
Where?
I was going to say something. Back when I started as an agent, it was very rare to see an agent also write books and do other creative things. You just didn't see it that much. Sometimes you saw it with book editors writing their own books, but now I know agents that write their own stuff, not necessarily poetry, but they have their hands in many jars, so to speak. So I think it's cool because it being an agent inspires me creatively. So it gives me the outlet. I get inspired by my clients. So and by listening to editors and what they have to say. So about the client's book. So for me, it's just very natural to do it. I don't have a lot of free time, but that's besides
Yeah.
the point.
Well, that's what I thought was so interesting because I'm 44 years old, so I was started trying to query agents in the mid, late 2000s, and that's what I noticed. You didn't see a lot of these agents who were involved in the creative aspect of the industry. And like I said, not only were you just doing the writing, you're also doing all these other things. So I guess let's just start at the beginning with the old generic question of where did all of this interest begin for you?
I always loved books, and in college, I actually thought I'd be an English professor, but I got into some politics in my English department, and I realized, well, if there's politics in a little place like this was Vassar College. Basically, I wanted to bring a poet named Robert Duncan over to Vassar College. He was the poet in residence at Bard, and he was a beat poet. And I was told, no, this is in the 1980s. No, we don't do beat poets. Like, it was so condescending. I said, if it were Allen Ginsberg, you'd say no. Anyway,
Yeah.
I got really put off by that. So I decided, well, if there's politics at a college, I may as well be out in the real world and make some money to suffer for the politics.
Yeah.
So I um, I wanted to work for a publisher, but I was a little paralyzed. And then a friend of mine said a literary agency is looking for someone, and this is in 1985, and I literally said, "What's a literary agency? I never heard of that."
Mhm.
We didn't learn that like Charles Dickens had an agent or something. So anyway,
Yeah,
she
you didn't
said
learn that.
her name is Jane Von Marin, and she said, "You know how actors and actresses have agents? Well, writers do too." And I said, "Oh, that makes sense." So here I am on the side of the Angels many decades later. And I was going to jump back to try and be an editor because I still wanted to do that. But I was told, oh, you've been an assistant for a year and a half, and we'd have to start you from scratch and you'll get bored. So I got very discouraged from trying to switch over. So I stayed. And then I joined a very large agency, and even larger now, called the William Morris Agency. I was in the book department, and it wasn't at that time very sexy to work there in the book department. Everyone was enamored of film and television, so it wasn't hard to get a job there. And I stayed there for 14 years. And I anticipated that I might get promoted, and I thought, I have to give them a reason. So I thought to myself, no one here does science fiction, fantasy, or horror. So I started doing research on the market, and they said, well, if you want to be an agent, you have to do science fiction and fantasy. And I thought, bingo, I was ready. So I had all these statistics and sales and all that. So I stayed there, and then William Morris got a lot of changes were going on, and basically the book department split in half. So I went to another agency for a while, and then I ended up at Greenberger 2.5 years later. And I've been at Sanford J. Greenberger, where I work, for 22 years. And we're most known for Dan Brown and Brad Thor. Eric Idle from Monty Python is one of my clients, and Patrick Rothfuss, Tad Williams, C.J. Cherry, and many others. And I enjoy being an agent there. It's a little different now since COVID lockdown, because some people work from different remote places. And but I'll just say the question I'm most asked as an agent is, how do I find an agent? Because people say they have trouble. And I would say you have to write a great query letter. That's how you get someone's attention. And if you can, mention what authors that the agent represents who you admire, and you could find out who the agent is in the acknowledgement section of a book you like. And then there are people like someone I know, and I'm going to give her a little shout here. She helps authors write query letters, because I think some authors really need it. So if you're going to say this is the next Harry Potter, you need someone to say, don't say that,
Yeah.
or this is the next Dune. Like, you're automatically not going to get an agent if you say stuff like that. So her name is Lindsay Rebar, and her address is reedsy.com/Lindsay, LINDSAY, dash RIBAR. And she's great with editing and also helping people with query letters. And I think she's the only person I know who does that. And I said to her, that's a great idea, because, authors, it's hard to write the elevator pitch, and it's hard to say what this is like. And it's hard to grab attention. And, Patrick Rothfuss had a terrible query letter. Thank goodness he said, thank goodness I never sent it to you. You would have never taken me on, because he never found an agent, because it was like 5 pages long. So there's that. And just doing research on what authors you like, which most people already know, and then who are their agents. I think it's a matter of finding someone with your taste. Mm-hmm. So that's the answer to the other thing is there's a website called Publishers Marketplace. It's not expensive, and you can see what agents are making deals. A lot of my clients go there to give me ideas of where I should submit their book. And I appreciate it a lot. It's called Publishers Marketplace.com, and there's a section called Latest Deals, and it's a great tool. I use it every day, literally.
Yeah, because I know one thing I've been told by others before, and I know how the climate changes all the time in the industry. I've had some that say a lot of agents won't take you on if you don't already have a platform of some kind. I know, because agents, they want to, that's how y'all make your living. You all want to make sure the book's going to sell, which makes sense, obviously.
Well, I would say it's more true with nonfiction than fiction, but yeah, they like you to have a lot of followers on Instagram and the rest of social media. I just had a nonfiction memoir turned down today because she doesn't have enough of a platform, even though the book is great. So that is true, and it's gotten truer because at the end of the day, most of the publishers don't want to do all the work. They want to slip the book into a machinery that's already up and running. So that's unfortunately true, but it's not impossible. And also, I deal with smaller presses because I have to. I don't all the time, and certainly financially, there's not much in it for me. But if I love a book, I just want to find the right home. And some things are really good, but a little too odd for the mainstream book world.
Right. Yeah, and I think writing to the market is something I've always been told, and I've always heard. It said you got to write for the market. You got to know the market if you want to go that route. But the thing about the financial thing, it's a lot of people are about how do you make money, how do you make a living as an author. And from all my experience and what I've been told in the research I've done, people I've talked to, it's like with more and more, with especially authors published after about 2010 or so, is that like it's becoming less and less common for an author to strictly make a living off just their writing. How true would you say that is?
Very true. I would say most authors do other things to make a living. I mean, I think that's true. But I do have authors that make a living off their writing as well. So and they're the ones that have been with me a long time and they're established. And, one cool thing as someone who does fantasy and science fiction, and I do other genres, by the way, but I don't do thrillers as much anymore because I find it, there's James Patterson and Harlan Coben and then there's everybody else sort of. I mean, there are more, Lee Child, there are more people than that, but it's very hard to break someone into that market. But with science fiction and fantasy, one thing I like is that it's a very, especially with fantasy, it's a very devoted audience once an author gets recognition. And the other cool thing that's gone on is like Hollywood, I'll tell you a story. Tad Williams had an idea, people don't know this, but George R.R. Martin was inspired by Tolkien and he was inspired by Tad Williams. And he goes on record saying that. So Tad must be like 25 years ago, had this idea of episodic, epic fantasy television. So we literally went to LA to pitch it and there was only like the Sci-Fi Channel at the time.
Yeah.
And we got laughed out of the room. So then when Game of Thrones happened, I said, Tad, I guess we were a little before our time.
Yeah. And Tad's great. Tad is phenomenal. I feel like you and I had this conversation through Messenger not that long ago, maybe a year or so ago, about how I feel like Tad just doesn't get the recognition as one of the top fantasy authors that he should get because he's great.
He's starting to. I see so many more mentions of him all over the place than I ever have in the years I've known him. And I've known him for 30 something years. And I think he's starting to get the recognition. And we hopefully have a television series in the works for Otherland. And then I have another client named Stephen Lawhead. He writes, he's known for the Pendragon cycle about King Arthur. And that is a television series that's already in the can. So I know 10 years ago, this would have never happened. So it's very exciting. And, television too, they have the strikes and all this other stuff, wildfires. So there's always unpredictable variables that can occur.
Yeah, there's no way to plan for bumps in the road. That's for certain, because you never know what those bumps are going to be. I know, like and that brings me to something else. The way media is handled now, such as books, television. I mean, you got more outlets for people who maybe can't get the agent, who can't get a pitch at a television. So like, there's people who do things on YouTube. Now there's self-publishing and indie press. There's a lot of different routes that people can go. So how do you have seen that has affected the market and created more opportunity? Because people are on the fence. Some people think it's been a negative thing. Some people think it's a positive thing.
I think it's generally good, but like to me, over the years, there were two recession-proof genres. One is children's books post Harry Potter. Now, when I first started in publishing, children's books were considered like Siberia. Like there were like 5 agents in that business. I started at an agency that had one of the star children's books agents named Marilyn Marlowe, and she represented all these, Newbery Award winning books. It was just like, including half of Goodnight Moon, she represented the illustrator, and she probably made a ton of money just from that alone. But children's books, it can have its problems, but it's still pretty big. It's huge now. And the other one was romance, but I was really surprised that a few years ago, the romance book market in mainstream publishing went dry, and it was because people were self-publishing and they were selling their books for $1.99 on Amazon. And I thought to myself, well, that will catch up because these people will think they're getting, a deal by buying a book for $1.99. But, it's kind of like getting a pizza slice in New York for $1. You're getting what you paid for. So
Yeah.
romance has come back because I think people realize that, that just because you self-publish and call yourself a romance writer doesn't mean you're very good at it. So, but everything's cyclical, and horror. Speaking of horror, that always goes in and out. I can't keep track of when it's in and when it's out.
Yeah, yeah.
And everyone would always say, editors always say, "I'm looking for the next Rosemary's Baby." I mean, I've heard that for 30 years. I'm not quite sure it's ever happened.
And no, it probably won't either.
I don't know if I answered the question, but
yeah, that's it's interesting because because that's the big issue with like self-publishing. There are people who just churn out a book a week and they don't even attempt to make it good, but they sell. But I think a lot of that stuff, like you said, that catches up. People are going to be like, well, this author's not very good. I'm not going to keep buying their stuff. Whereas presses and authors who maybe put out better quality, they kind of rise to the top. So I think there's a positive there to shift the landscape, and especially now away from the bad authors.
There are always authors who do self-publish, and then they get this huge audience, and then the question to themselves are, well, I might not be in Barnes and Noble, but Amazon sure is selling a lot of copies of my books. Maybe I don't need a publisher. Maybe I don't need an agent. Maybe I should just stick with this, plan because it's working. And I understand that. But then I know others that, they dream of being in Barnes and Noble, and they dream of being published by Random House. So they decide to just go for it and get, if they're selling that many copies, publisher is going to be interested. But it's interesting because some books would do well on Amazon, and then people like me would read it and I'd go, this isn't very good. And I start to realize publishers, they still won't publish it even if it's selling, if it's not that good. So I respect that integrity.
Yeah, I do too. I think that's something that I've noticed. A lot of the people who put a lot of books out there, you can read them and you can tell it's just like, because I'm the same way. Like I like the freedom. I'm real choosy. I've wanted to have an agent, but I'd be real choosy about and plus, like you said, writing something that's more mainstream is better. And I write really weird stuff. Like stuff I write is really not general pop,
But you're doing what you want, Yeah.
But then there's people, like you said, who have that dream and they want to, and those are the people. I think it's just about different approaches and different mindsets. Like there's people who really want to push and write for the market and want to go that route. And then there's people who are just happy to have their book out there and find their audience.
Yeah. Like, do you know Sebastian Dubinsky? I think you do.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. He's on my friends list.
Yeah. Like he's a professor. He lives in Denmark, though he's French, but he spent much of his childhood a few years of his childhood in California. So he knows American pop culture really well. He writes in French and English, and he doesn't try to make a living from his writing. He's happy to have, he has a publisher called Meerkat Press, and they're really good, and they get him, and they do really interesting books. And he's getting more recognition than he ever has had. And I think a publisher of a certain kind are very happy to have him on their list. And he would rather write what he wants to write and say what he has to say than write something just blatantly commercial. And I don't put down blatantly commercial, because
I
want that too. I like both.
I'm the same way. I like both. I respect both. I respect both approaches. Just like, and it's like people talk about how you mentioned something earlier about the publishers just wanting to kind of slip it into the machine and not wanting to do all the work. And I get that, because their job is, they're publishers, right? Their job is to publish. And I know I've heard a lot of people talk about even the bigger presses, the big 5 or big 4, whatever you want to call them right now at this point. They still want their authors to do a lot of footwork and do a lot of promotion, because it's kind of a half and half deal, I would say.
They do, and sometimes I say to myself, God, when I first sold this to them, it's like almost the most attention they paid to that book, editing it, etc. And then when it comes out, sometimes they just throw it up against the wall and see if it sticks, And I don't like that approach. And there are some publishers, who shall remain nameless, who do that, who do that too much.
Yeah.
And I just sold a book to an imprint at HarperCollins. They do like 10 books a year, and I love that. They're called Harper Select. I love that, because that means they're going to pay attention, So I'm sure it's very hard to get on that list, but if you're on it, that's great. So, I think publishers are always still trying to find their way. Should we do this as a trade paperback original, because no one wants to pay $35 for a first novel, or instead they'll pay $18. But the problem is, if you do it as a trade paperback original, as some publishers do, and there are some publishers who don't follow that model, like Daw Books, because they want. And Daw publishes Tad Williams and Patrick Rothfuss. They want the book to have life in different mediums, like hardcover, paperback, ebook, special editions, if they're successful. So I go back and forth, but I more sign on to the hardcover model and having different manifestations of the book, because the book gets more attention if it has different manifestations. It's getting to different audiences. There are people that will pay $35, and there are people that won't, so I had a first novel recently, and it was done as a trade paperback original, because they said, Barnes and Noble, they love trade paperback originals. But it did well, but I wish it hadn't been published that way. Actually, I think it would have been done better with a multi-approach. But these are things, now I'm asking myself, well, is China 125% tariff thing going on? How is that going to affect publishing? Because most books, I believe, are printed in China. So, and I don't think there are that many printing presses left in the States. So enough to do everything. So I'm curious how that will change, or if the tariffs will go away, et cetera.
Gosh, that I've been wondering about that too. Part of what Nightmare Press does is, we send authors a certain amount of copies for free when they sign up after, it gets published. And I'm like, man, people who are overseas, I hope I'm able to keep that promise to them. I don't know how much these tariffs are going to affect that. But that's a whole different conversation, right?
Yeah. Well, I know that publishers during COVID lockdown and the supply chain became disruptive. I know there were problems with books being published on time because the printers were behind. It was taking longer to get here. Just a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and it was a wild time. That's for certain. So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about your creative work. You've given the author some good advice on how the industry is right now and how to get into it. So you got a couple of poetry books getting ready to come out, and you've written several. I read a book of yours called Wonder Weavers. It was about, the UFO sightings and everything. I really enjoyed it. So you want to tell us a little bit about the poetry books you have coming out?
Yeah. Well, you heard this story already, but
Yeah.
I was an English major at Vassar College, as I said earlier, and I wanted to be a poet and be an English professor. So um, at the end of my time there, I did my junior year or junior semester abroad in London, and I had some really tough professors. I was more used to getting praise for what I wrote, and these people, like, I felt like they wanted to put you down all the time. And my ego, my 22-year-old or 21-year-old ego, just could not take it. And I was supposed to do a creative thesis at Vassar, which was very hard to get. It means I could write a book of poetry instead of writing like a thesis essay. And I got it. And then I panicked and said to my advisor, I don't want to do this. I can't. And she said, you've been talking about this for 3 years. I said, I can't control it. I just can't write. So I had writer's block for 25 years. So you're talking to someone who's very sympathetic when people have writer's block. They can't help it. I had
Yeah.
to sort of let it go and just accept that I wasn't going to write again. And that was how it came back. I started doing photography. I started painting later on. And then just, I had this poet friend named Matthew Rohr, who's been on the cover of American Poetry Review. He's pretty well known. And I started writing poems. And I knew him from being a dad, and our kids were literally like not much beyond strollers. So I ran to the playground where I knew he was at and said, look, I wrote, and I shoved it in his face. I was so excited. He was like, oh my God. Anyway, and then I had never gotten a poem published in a journal because I stopped writing before I ever could. So one of my prize moments is when I got some poems in the now defunct Green Mountains Review. And I was just so proud of myself. And my friend Matt said, well, Matt, you were always interested in poetry. Like, it never left you. You still bought volumes of it. We talked about it. So I'm not surprised that it came back. So I decided that if I do go back to writing poetry, I want to be a cool guy like Matt Rohr, who's not a professor like him because it was too late for that. But all his students loved him. I could just see it.
Yeah, he
wasn't full of himself. And
oh yeah, that's a plus.
yeah. And then I decided that if I ever did write poetry again, I would write about what you see on the Discovery Channel at 3 a.m. So I wrote, and I said, no one writes about the supernatural. Well, not no one, but very few write about the supernatural and the paranormal and all that. And so my poems started off very short. And then as time progressed, like, I kept taking on these bigger subjects like Bigfoot and Wonder Weavers, which was about these airships that were mysteriously spotted mostly in the Southwest before the Wright brothers could fly. And no one knows. I mean, that's one of those stories where there were so many sightings that I don't think it's made up. And then later on, there was an artist drawings that were found in like a thrift store, and they were notated in German. And there were these very schematic drawings of airships. And it's thought that this guy, and I forget his name because it's a while ago, he was sort of he was documenting the building of these airships. So who knows if it's true, but I like these subjects not because they're true or not true. It didn't matter to me. I liked it because I could write about humans that way, and I didn't feel comfortable writing directly about myself. There's a famous UFO hunter, and I'm blanking on his name, but he once said, and I love this quote, I believe in everything and nothing. And that's kind of how when I read that, I was like, wow, that's me.
Yeah.
So So it was really fun to write these supernatural things. It would take me a long time because there was a lot of research. And then I had to spin it in my own way, and find a sort of made up plot that I put in and made up characters. There'd often be a historical thread and also a contemporary thread. And I try and, I once wrote about, which I never published, about whether the Apollo missions were fake. And I wrote, it was a very interesting subject because why is the flag waving on the moon? How come if they brought no lights, the shadows are all over the place on the moon? It looks like it was done on a stage. I mean, there are a lot of people that definitely believe that.
Yeah, it's a big belief. It's conspiracy theory.
Yeah, so, I represented someone who worked for NASA for years, and and he wrote. I sold his memoir. His name is Jack Clemens, and I was afraid to show it to him because I thought he'd bite my head off. But I also wrote about the other side of that, which there are people that believe that not only did we go to the moon, but we had some secret missions to the moon to look for alien wreckage, and we did a joint mission with the Russians. It was a lot with the Soviets. So I like looking at a subject from many different angles. So anyway, long story short, my wife of many years became ill, and she had breast cancer, and she had a stage 4 for 14 years, which is a long time for someone to live with that. And she used to tease me that I never write about her. I should be your muse, etc. So after she passed away, all of this was the elephant in the room. So I could not write. I didn't feel like I had a block. I was just trying to figure. It was a lot of processing going on, but I just started to write, and I wrote about her and us and her illness and dying and our love. And, I covered a lot of this. And then I would post these poems on Facebook, and I would get hundreds of responses. It was like incredible. And some people would say, thank you for expressing what I went through. I could not ever express it the way you did. Or some people are like, thank you for educating me about what it's like to lose a loved one.
I remember those poems. A lot of them, they were really good too. I remember reading several of them that you posted.
Yeah, it was just like, thank you. And so I've been writing, I wrote this one called View Masterland. It was published in 2023. Again, in this case, and this one called Matrix. So believe it or not, about 10 months after my wife passed away, I met this woman named Mary. Actually, she found me I somehow stupidly went on Match, or maybe not so stupidly, but a friend convinced me to go on it. I didn't think I was ready. I thought it was crazy. And also I have a now 22-year-old daughter, but at the time she was 17. But I went on and met this other woman, and she's great. And so now I write about grieving and finding new love. And the revelation I had is I can do both. They're both about love, and I also have a girlfriend who's very understanding and sympathetic, and she's had her own losses in her life. So, and also she lost her dad when she was not much older than my daughter Izzy. So she was very sympathetic to Izzy. Now, of course, not to go off on that, but basically it took a while for my daughter to be accepting that I was with someone else. And now my daughter loves her and her daughter. So as my daughter says, we're like a new family. And so I'm happy for my daughter. Anyway, we all deserve happiness after going through something like this. And I have found my writing, I was no longer writing about the supernatural stuff that much, though. My next poem, which is coming out from Stalking Horse Press in May, on May 12th to be exact, is called Fantastic Voyage. Humorously, it's about, it doesn't go into detail, but it was brought on by me getting a colonoscopy. And I was actually thinking, this is weird because 10 years ago, my wife, you have to be picked up after you by someone or they won't let you leave. So my wife picked me up 10 years ago, and now my girlfriend was picking me up 10 years later. So I was thinking, God, that's so weird. It's like I'm time traveling. And also the whole camera thing and your body. So it made me think of Fantastic Voyage, like the little ship going through a body. And then I thought of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea because they used terms like polyps and all that.
Yeah.
And time tunnel because I felt like I was time traveling, you know.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of fun writing about like pop culture and old TV shows, especially sci-fi shows and all that. So that's what I'm doing now. And then I've been doing New York street photography for a very long time, for actually this year it's 40 years that I've been doing it. So it's very interesting. When I was first out there, I'd see some famous photographers still alive, still doing it. And sometimes I'd go up and introduce myself. But, you know, and this is before phones and all that. And this is before digital. I had a film camera and I always had to develop the film, and I hated the chemicals and all that. But now everything's digital mostly. And I see so many street photographers out there. And, you know, I could tell by the way they hold the camera or what kind of camera it is. And in the old days, I used to go, you know, there are so few of us, like we don't know each other. But now there's so many. It's like I find no point. But we always noticed each other. It's kind of like snipers, right? You know, assassins. They kind of know when they see another assassin because, you know, they just want to make sure that they're not the one being hit on, you know. So
Yeah.
And then I started doing watercolor painting because my wife and I went to Mendocino, California, and I just was watching this watercolor painting class sitting in front of the inn we were staying at. And I was like, wow, that looks so cool and relaxing. And wow, that'd be great. Because my family used to have a house in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts, which is quite rural and great landscapes. And I didn't want to do landscape painting. So I was in a framing store because I would get my photographs framed. And I asked one of the people that worked there, hey, do you know anyone that teaches watercolor? She said, yeah, me. And I was like, oh. I took a few classes with her. And then after that, I was basically self-taught. And it's just fun. I like to cook. And I think doing watercolor painting is kind of like cooking. It's partially planned in that I look up recipes and I draw something, and then it's improv after that.
Yeah.
And also, they always say watercolor, if you make a mistake, you know, it's merciless, but you learn that you can correct mistakes or use the mistake, you know, make it work. So they're both fun. I would say street photography, like I used to have more people say, hey, did you just take my picture?
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Oh, I get that like once a year now. And it's funny. I've noticed some things about New York, like on Fridays, everyone has more pop in their step because it's going to be the weekend.
Yeah. They're like, let's go home.
Right before the holidays, everyone has more pop in their step. Like I would say the day after New Year's is like the most sullen day in New York. It's like, it's all over. And a lot of kids notice that you've taken a picture. Kids are very observant.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll sometimes hear, Daddy, that man just took our picture.
Yeah.
I love it. I love watching people on the street. I love looking for patterns. It's kind of like improv too. Like, you know, someone once compared it to jazz. You're always just looking for associations. And after I photograph, I'm always mentally exhausted because I've just been looking really hard for like an hour to an hour and a half.
Yeah, you capture a lot of really, really good and stuff. And I've noticed, like, I've always wanted to, like, since I was younger, wanted to carry a camera around with me and take pictures. And after seeing some of your photography that you share on Facebook, I started just going out and taking more pictures. And
good.
I like to find, like, you know, the urban blight areas and like the places where like the neighborhoods like abandoned or like abandoned shopping centers, you know, stuff like that. But there's some of that around here. There's not a lot, but I like a lot of that stuff. And I went out and started taking a lot of pictures, but I don't ever do anything with them. I don't ever get them developed, but I probably should try.
Well, my daughter and I are talking about, I mean, she's very good with computers and design and all that. We're talking about self-publishing a big photography book of mine, but we're trying to figure out how to do that without going broke.
Yeah,
it was also interesting because during COVID lockdown, there was nobody out there on the streets. I mean,
yeah,
I would drive to see my girlfriend and I could park right on the street. There were no cars on the road. It was like, I Am Legend. It's
I
like
am Legend. Yeah,
yeah, it was like that. I felt like the last person on earth.
that's got to be very surreal in New York, of all places, to see.
Yeah, you could park almost anywhere. There were no cars. It was bizarre, but there was no one on the streets to photograph. And then there started to be, but everyone was wearing a mask. So I was saying to myself, what should I just embrace this whole mask thing, and just kind of document what's going on? And that's what I started to do. But
you can say that's some people remember, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, looking back on that.
Yeah, so I did it a bit. I know people that did it a lot more than I did. And it's funny because, I was in New York on 9/11 and our office was in the process of moving. And I know a lot of photographers that ran down there, and I didn't even have my camera with me that day. And I thought it didn't even occur to me to run down to ground zero. I thought, because I was seeing people coming uptown with all this ash all over them, it was unbelievable to see.
Yeah.
I just thought, well, I'm not a photojournalist, and I was afraid to. It didn't occur to me because I just assumed that it's terrible for the body to breathe in all that stuff.
Yeah, it can't be good.
But I saw some good photographs that were taken, and nope, I didn't jump on it. And I don't really regret it because I think there are people that would have done it much better than me. And also, I hear, I was hearing about people's eyes were stinging from all the smoke, so I didn't want to deal with that.
Yeah, I've seen videos that people have taken, and there was one where someone actually ended up not being able to outrun that giant cloud, and it just looked awful. I mean, I wouldn't want to have been in, I'll tell you that much.
Well, I was in my office that day. It was right near St. Patrick's Cathedral, and actually, I'd gotten out of the subway that morning, and I saw people standing on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral looking downtown. And I thought, oh, tourist. And I didn't even think to look at what they were looking at. And then I was entering the office and someone said, a plane hit the World Trade Center. And I thought, oh, that's what they're looking at. So I went back to St. Patrick's and I saw them it was only the first one. So I saw the first tower on fire, and I thought to myself, if anyone's above those flames, they are dead because there's no way to get out. No. And then later on, there were no subways, blah blah blah. So finally, I could take the F train home to Brooklyn because it doesn't really run near that far downtown. And that would, there's a part of the F train that's on the elevated tracks, and it was the quietest subway ride of my life.
I bet.
We were elevated. Everyone just looked out the window to see all the smoke from both towers at that point. And wow, what a day.
Yeah, I was 20. I think I was 20 years old when that happened. I was 20 years old, and I remember someone calling me, telling me about it. I was like, wow, that's crazy. I wonder how. No one had any aspect, at that moment, no one would have thought that it was what was going on. It was pretty wild. So I can imagine that the streets were probably a different place at that time.
Yeah, and my wife was also on an airplane that morning. So instead of running down with a camera, which I didn't have that day anyway, I was more concerned about where my wife was. And a third party called me and he lives in Connecticut, to tell me that she was all right. Like she called him and he called me to tell me, because the cell phones weren't working. So it was very unnerving, the whole thing, to say the least.
Yeah, I would guess your mind was totally on something else other than taking pictures at that point, for certain.
Yeah, I did have a client who got caught in this. I don't remember if I had I did have a cell phone, because I just said cell phones weren't working. I have a client who shall remain nameless who called me that day, and he lives in New York, and asked me if I'd looked at his contract yet. No, I have not looked at your contract yet.
Did he know what had happened?
Yes, he goes, because he said, yeah, I know what happened. That's too bad. Have you looked at my contract yet? I was like, oh.
God. Yeah, some a lot of authors, they kill me, man. I don't even get like we hear about because we do a lot of like we go to a lot of different locations around, and we're always told like when we do book signings, the places they always like us because they're like, oh, they tell us horror stories about some of the authors who come in there and just the way they behave, and it's just like there's this etiquette. I mean, for one, being an author is there's this etiquette, but two, then you just also just being human. Someone lives in New York who just witnessed all that, and you think they would be like, okay, I understand. I mean, geez.
One author of mine who always been really great with like booksellers and publishing people is Tad Williams. Like, I think the people that work with him always feel very appreciated. And something, it pays off for him because they no one wants to work for a jerk, or someone who's
No.
unappreciative or
Yeah.
self-entitled.
Yeah, you get a lot of
I
that.
always tell my authors to be gracious, like these publicists, they're not being paid that much, I mean, there are certainly other jobs they could do which will pay more. And it's sort of a thankless job, at the actual publisher. I mean, I think it's gotten better. But yeah, I always say be gracious. So because be human,
Yeah, and it's not, and if you're not like, if you don't care enough about being respectful and just being a respectful human being, at least use your logic and think, well, this is how people are going to remember me. This is how I'm presenting myself. So if you can at least think of it from a business perspective and act normal, don't act like a jerk to people. But Ted strikes me as a nice guy. I've not had too many conversations really with him, but I've followed him on Facebook for a long time, and he just always seems like a pretty pleasant individual.
Oh, he's great. I just saw him a few months ago. We hadn't seen each other in a long time. He and his wife Deborah are fantastic, and he's people used to say, oh, he takes too long. He's like a writing machine now. Like he really and his books are very complex, and he
They are.
said something like, I'm a little late with my new one because I have to figure out a lot of world building. He goes, I know this is a world I've written about many times before, but sometimes I forget and I have to go back and look.
Oh, I get it. I understand that. I'm not Tad Williams, but I'm saying like I write and I develop a lot of complex stuff, and it goes here, there, here, and there. So I understand. You have to stop and think about it. So I can imagine someone writing on the level of Tad Williams. I can only imagine how frustrating and time consuming that can be.
Exactly. Well, I'm happy that he's starting to, well, he used to get a lot of attention. He was a New York Times bestseller. See, that's another thing. And I don't think he'd mind if I talk about this. He didn't have an agent for his first few books. And I took him on right when he became a bestseller with the book called To Green Angel Tower, which was the first Austin Ard book in his first trilogy. And he said to me, well, if you want to be my agent, you have to know one thing. Don't ever ask me to write in this world again. I won't. And don't ever bring it up. I said, okay. So then he wrote various other worlds that had nothing to do with Austin Ard. He went, Otherland is more science fiction. And he lost some of his audience. And I think had he continued with the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series, otherwise known as Austin Ard, it would have been HBO's Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. I really believe that. Because there was such a huge groundswell with him. And then one day, about 10 years ago, we were having dinner, and he said, guess what? I want to write more Austin Ard novels. I said, oh my God. And this was 25 years later. He was going back. And I think he just had, because he always said, I was so sick of my world, and I just didn't know how I could continue it. But he said, I finally, 25 years later, figured out how I can continue this story. So anyway, it's really cool.
Yeah, that is a good story. I haven't read the entire thing, but I've read some of it. It's pretty good. In the Otherland. And
that takes place in virtual reality. And
yeah,
I think he was one of the first authors to certainly deal with that subject in a huge way. And I think there's no way Ready Player One exists without that author having read Otherland.
I agree. I think it's almost, I don't know anything much about that author who wrote that, but if they haven't said it, they read it. So, I mean, but
yeah, on the, I haven't gone there recently, but in Wikipedia's entry for virtual reality, it mentions Otherland. So I was like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, and the one about the cat, the tail chaser song.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that was the first one I read of his when I was a lot younger, and I really liked it, and that's kind of what got me into him. And I thought that's when I was like pretty cool when I came across it. I was like, oh man, this guy represents Tad Williams. That's awesome. But
well, I didn't represent that one. Those first
that was his first
four books of his. He didn't have an agent.
Yeah.
And then he realized that as things were getting more complicated with his publishing world, he decided he did want an agent, and he wanted someone who he thought could get along with his editor. So I know a bunch of agents were courting him, but he chose me.
Yeah. Well, it's probably because he probably sensed the appreciation for creativity that you have that we discussed at the beginning of the podcast. Like I said, I think it's cool that you deal with smaller presses as well, and you understand the smaller indie press world. You're not just always like, oh, we got to get you the biggest, whatever,
Well, sometimes I see agents, and I go to myself, like they could be selling shoes. Like I don't think it would matter. Like they like to sell, and I like to sell too. I think the fun part about agenting is being involved creatively with helping an author bring the project to a certain point. It's still going to have an editor if it gets that far.
Right.
But helping make the project happen, contributing, helping with ideas, saying this part doesn't work, this part's great, do more of that. And then selling it. It's like my favorite part of the job, by far. But I know some agents who, they could be selling anything because that's what they like to do, just sell. But it's not like they don't like books, they do, but I love books and I love creativity, and I find it inspiring for myself. And I love being around something and seeing it get made and be put together, and it's really fun. And actually the author who I probably learned the most from with this stuff is Tad, because I would read one of his books as a draft, and then I would listen to his conversations with he now has one editor named Betsy Woheim. He had another editor as well, and they would both share the duties. And I would just learn so much from listening to the two editors. I'd learn about storytelling. I'd learn about epic fantasy. I'd learn about structure, which I put in my own writing, I think. That's why some of these things are epic, because I sell tomes, so
yeah.
And so I learned a lot from both Tad and from his editors. So yeah. And I learned actually how to be an agent for other epic fantasy writers, because I understood better what the issues were. Like, evil can't be just evil. Evil usually thinks they're doing good. I mean, just simple things like that. Or, have keep the antagonist busy, keep them going. Or, with great, it's the old thing with great power comes with a cost. I was going to say with great power comes responsibility, but which is also true, but it's also comes with a cost. And that was a huge lesson I learned.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's realistic anyway. I mean, it's kind of true, even outside of storytelling. But I definitely get what you're saying about liking the process of creation, because that's part of I think that's the main thing I enjoy most about running Nightmare Press is I like seeing these projects that people send me thinking, God, these are really good. And I want to get them out there so people can read them and just having them made. So I definitely get what you're saying. It's a labor of love. It's about loving the books.
Well,
And
I'll ask you a question. Do you get a lot of submissions, and how do you keep up with that and your own writing and running the press?
It's difficult. When I reopened Nightmare Press last year, um, from from the day we opened up until the end of the year, we ended up, I can't remember the exact number, but it was 200 plus submissions altogether.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, what happened? Because we never got that many before. But we
What
were
did
more.
happen?
Yeah, I don't know. I think because I was out of it for a few years, I wasn't involved much because we had just a lot of personal stuff going on, and I feel like looking around at the indie scene that there's mostly a lot of horror genres, but also a good portion of them were kind of not really publishing anybody new. They were all kind of a network of people who were publishing each other, who knew each other, so they decided to open their own press. So a lot of people weren't getting in, but we also opened to sci-fi, fantasy, dark fantasy, just different genres, and there was just not a lot of indie presses out there taking that stuff that were there are, but then there's some that were a lot bigger, so they couldn't take on as many. And
You might, because sometimes I look up indie presses and you find all these lists of places, and you might have gotten more submissions because Nightmare might have gotten on to some of these lists.
yeah, I did see it pop up on some lists. And when I was looking through it, I don't know how many, and I know some of them were like, yeah, my friend told me about this, or my mentor or another author told me. And I was like, man, oh, and it's such a common name, Nightmare Press. I was really surprised no one had it. So
I am too, actually.
yeah, because people get these companies names and they're just kind of out there and they're weird, and it's not a lot of people are going to search it. I liked a lot of the weird stuff, don't get me wrong, but I thought, well, I want something simple because like our first one, when my wife and I started doing just paranormal nonfiction, it was Anubis Press. That was something very simple, and to my surprise, that was no longer owned by anybody, not on a large scale. So I think about simplicity probably helps, but yeah, it's obviously I couldn't take on anywhere near that many projects, so I had to decline a lot of great books. But I hope they find a home, and I hope other people start doing that too.
Well, I think definitely with horror, there are a fair number of indie presses, and
A ton, yeah.
I'm seeing it more with science fiction. I see it less with fantasy. So
Yeah, there's not a lot. We got a lot of fantasy. I did get a lot of fantasy, and I was glad about that because I know outside of like Tor and a few, they're the big cheese, and then there's a few other mid-level presses that pick that stuff up. But then the rest, it seems like there's just not that much.
yeah, when I first started as an agent, there weren't that many epic fantasy writers. You could count them on your one hand, really.
Right.
Now they're all over the place. And also there weren't that many agents doing what I did, and now there are a dime a dozen, unfortunately.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So
well, that's why you're a senior agent now, and you can pick and choose and do the things you want to do, right?
Yes, it's totally true, and I'm so glad I'm there. And my office has a lot of younger agents, and I try to mentor them as much as I can because the next generation is important. And I don't, sometimes I remember, when I first started out, I'd have I'd have questions that, I now take for granted, but, the publisher turned down the author's option book. How do I break it to the author? That was a good question. I would have had that very same question. I mean, the answer was, well, be honest. And maybe if it did poorly in sales, the author might have to consider using a pseudonym, which often happens. And that's tricky because at some point you got to tell them who the author's real name. But at that point, I mean, you can't lie. I don't lie, at least, but then they're going to see the author's real name on a contract anyway. But
Right. Yeah.
but I don't want them to look up sales figures before they ever read the book, because then they're coming in with a preconceived notion, and I can't stand that. Just read it for what it is.
Yeah, a lot of times poor sales might not even be because it's not good. It might just be because the marketing was off, or they didn't find the
Oh,
audience.
it's definitely often, most of the time, it's not because it's not good.
Yeah.
It's, to get published, especially by a big publisher, but even many indies, you have to be pretty good.
Yeah.
And I think some people try to get published before they're really ready. I mean, I've heard some authors say you got to write 4 books before that 5th one gets published, and stuff like that, because you got to learn from the process. Another piece of advice I'll give before we end this is authors, aspiring authors, but any authors, they should have beta readers, not just their good friends, but join a writers group, learn from other writers, join a group where you trust their opinion. And when the first one gets published, you're going to get intelligence about how this happens. But also, most good authors, they have readers that give them a lot of feedback and make the books better. And also writing classes for that genre. Like, I have a client, I read something by her in 2019, and she was good, but for my purposes, she wasn't good enough yet. Then she went away for, I don't know, a year or so, and she sent me something, and I said, how did you get so good? And she took this workshop called the Odyssey Writing Workshop, run by this woman named Jean Cavellos. And I sat in on her workshops, and Jean is one of the best critics and editors that I know. And she just was, I could tell she was this author's drill sergeant, and she made her a much better writer, and it made a difference. It's how I got her published.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a lot of things. That's a whole other topic we could talk about, is writing courses, because there's some that are beneficial and then run by people who truly know what they're doing and have experience. And then there's some that are not so much so, and they're run by people who don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think the best way to go about that is word of mouth from someone who took it, who did it.
Right.
I mean, I don't even know what all the writing, I know there's Clarion. I guess that still goes on.
I've heard of them. I don't know if it still does.
That's considered one of the good ones. And Odyssey, definitely. I mean, I think a lot of authors have gotten published, have come out of that workshop. I've seen her critique someone's short story, which I also read, and I'm like, wow, she's insightful. Like, I would have never thought of that. But I don't consider myself an editor. I'm more like, I don't line edit. I more give like as one client said to me, you don't tell me how to fix something, but you tell me that something is not working. And sometimes you come up with ideas to fix it, but often you don't. You just tell me what's wrong. And that's what I do a lot. Like, a lot of times it's pacing issues. It's lagging. The character's not deep enough, or something's not believable. It's so many things.
Yeah, there's so many facets to writing and so many possibilities. And yeah, it's definitely an uphill battle, even if you've been doing it for a long time. That's for sure. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on.
Sure, it was a pleasure. It was great, and I'll be in touch with you, Jacob, about the other stuff we were talking about.
Okay, great. Yeah, I appreciate it. Again,
thank you for having me. Thank you for watching, folks. I hope it wasn't boring.
And see you next time.